Hey y'all, so in this video we're going to go over basically one big concept, and that concept is going to be absolute and comparative advantage. And so just as a heads up, this is going to be a longer video mainly because there's a lot of things we need to talk about with absolute and comparative advantage here. How does the moon cut its hair? Eclipse it. So, specialization and trade. So, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do people actually trade? And there's a lot of different reasons as to why people trade, but we're going to focus on two things. Number one, well, people trade because A, it leads to more choices and ultimately a higher standard of living. Well, how does that actually happen? Well, here, if everyone specializes in the production of some goods and then trades for the other goods that they don't have, ultimately, right, that is going to lead towards a higher standard of living for both countries, for both participants in that trade. And so through absolute and comparative advantage, which we're going to talk about in this video, and terms of trade, which we're going to be talking about in our next video, we are going to learn exactly how that leads to higher standards of living and why trade is actually a good thing. So before we get on to the definitions of absolute and comparative advantage, we first have to talk about this idea of per unit opportunity cost. So we already know what opportunity cost is, right? Opportunity cost is the next best thing you're giving up. So if you make a choice, the second option is going to be your opportunity cost. So your per unit opportunity cost is just the opportunity cost over the number of units gained. And so here, let's look at this example. Well, this example states, right, that it's going to cost us $50 to produce 5 t-shirts. And it's asking us what the per unit cost is. What is the per unit opportunity cost of producing 5 t-shirts here? So here, we can just plug our numbers into the equation. Well, here, what are we gaining? Well, we're gaining 5 t-shirts, right? That is what we are gaining here. Well, then to gain those 5 t-shirts, what exactly are we giving up? Well, we're giving up $50. And so now it's just a simple math problem, right? 50 over 5. So here we can say that it's going to cost $10 per shirt. And that is our per unit cost for each shirt there. And so now let's take money out of the equation, because here on the AP exam and also on assessments, we're never really going to look at per unit opportunity cost with money. Instead, we're going to be looking at sort of what are the other goods that this hypothetical person or business is giving up to produce this other good here. So here, let's take money out of the equation, right? Instead of producing 5 shirts, we could have made 10 hats. So what is the per unit opportunity cost for each shirt in terms of hats given up? Well, here, right, well, what are we giving up? So it's asking for the opportunity cost for each shirts, right, in terms of hats given up here. And so here, we're giving up 5 t-shirts, or we're gaining 5 t-shirts, and we're giving up 10 hats. So here, one shirt costs 2 hats. And then if we move on to the other one, it's essentially the same question, but we're sort of flipping it, right? So what are we giving up? Well, here we're giving up 5 hats. And we are gaining, right, we're giving up 5 shirts, and we're gaining 5 hats. So here, one hat is going to cost us a 1/2 of a shirt, right? So pretty simple. And so here's the guided practice. Yet again, just take a moment, just fill it in yourself. The answer is going to be in the notes section of the Google Slides. Right? All right. So now that we know how to calculate the per unit opportunity cost, let's talk about the actual definition of these different things. So absolute advantage. Basically, we have this nice little definition. Basically, what absolute advantage is if you can produce more, right? So let's say that J can produce 5 hats. while Daniel, D, can produce 4 hats. Well, who has the absolute advantage? J does, because J can just produce more hats than D. Right? Pretty simple. Comparative advantage, on the other hand, is whoever has the lower opportunity cost. Okay, so whoever has a lower opportunity cost has the comparative advantage. And so here we are going to say that if you have the comparative advantage in the production of a good, you should only produce that, you should specialize and only produce that one good. And that's why it says here in the last bullet point here, right, that they should specialize in the good that is cheaper for them to produce. And a good is cheaper if the country has the lower opportunity cost. So let's actually put this into practice to sort of clear up any confusion. So here, right, we have the USA and we have Brazil, and they can produce either wheat or sugar. So the US can produce 30 pounds, or whatever we want to call it, of wheat, or 30 pounds of sugar. Brazil can produce 10 pounds of wheat and 20 pounds of sugar, right? So here, if the question's asking which country has the comparative advantage in wheat, well, here we first have to calculate our per unit opportunity cost to figure out who has the comparative advantage. Well, here, right, one wheat. Well, here we said it's the opportunity cost over the number of units gained. Well, here it's just 30 over 30, right? So one wheat is going to cost the United States one sugar, which means that one sugar is going to cost the United States one wheat to produce. Well, for Brazil, what is it? For Brazil, right, one wheat is going to cost them 2 sugar. Why? Well, remember, our equation is the opportunity cost over the number of units gained. So here, if Brazil is producing wheat, well, what are they giving up? Well, they're giving up the production of 20 pounds of sugar, and they're gaining 10 pounds of wheat, which equals 2. And then we're just going to do the same thing with sugar, but honestly, we could just take the inverse, so half of a wheat here. So here, this question is asking us, well, who has the comparative advantage in wheat? Well, here we have to look at the per unit opportunity cost. Who has the lower opportunity cost here when producing wheat? Well, it's the United States. So we're going to say, right, well, which country has the comparative advantage in wheat? Well, the United States does. Why? Well, because for every pound of wheat that they're producing, they're giving up 1 pound of sugar. While Brazil, for every pound of wheat they're producing, they're giving up 2 pounds of sugar there. Right? And so that's basically what this is telling us here. And so when we're talking about comparative advantage, there are actually 2 different types of comparative advantage you guys have to keep in mind. This first one is known as the output method. Okay? And so we know that we're talking about like an output style comparative advantage type of question whenever we're talking about just sort of what is being produced, right? The actual physical amount that's being produced at the end of the day. So in this question, we're saying it's looking at the number of CDs and the pounds of beef that can be produced in 1 hour. So that's just saying Japan can produce 4 CDs and 2 pounds of beef in 1 hour. Canada can produce 4 CDs and 6 pounds of beef in 1 hour, right? And so to calculate the absolute comparative advantage, right, for output questions is just the other number goes over. So if we're looking at CDs, right, so 1 CD, we're looking at CDs. Well, what's the other good that we're comparing it to? Well, it's beef. So here, we're looking at they can produce 4 CDs or 2 pounds of beef. Well, if the other number goes over for looking at CDs, well, it's just 2 over 4, which is 1/2 of beef. Here, right? If we're looking at beef, well, what's the other good? CDs. So the 4 goes over 2, which equals 2 CDs. Right? So let's do it for Canada, right? So here, if we're looking at CDs, well, what's the other good? Well, the other good is beef, right? So we take 6, divide it by 4, which is 3/2 or 1.5 beef. And then here we do it, right? If we're looking at beef, well, what's the other good? We're looking at CDs, so that's 4 divided by 6 is just 2/3 of a CD here. Well, now that we know this, now we can figure out the comparative advantage here, right? So who has the comparative advantage in the production of CDs? Remember, we're looking for the lower per unit opportunity cost here. Well, Japan, for every CD, they're giving up 1/2 pound of beef, Canada, for every CD, they're giving up 3 halves of beef. So the lower opportunity cost here is half a pound of beef. So Japan should specialize and only produce CDs. Well, then who should specialize and produce beef? Well, for Japan, for every pound of beef, they're giving up the production of 2 CDs. For Canada, for every pound of beef, they're only giving up 2/3 of a CD. So because 2/3 is less than 2, Canada should not produce any CDs and only produce beef here. And then they're going to trade eventually. The other type of comparative advantage question is known as an input question. So this is different, right? Output questions just looks at the how many goods you can produce. Input questions takes a look at, well, what are the resources you need to produce those goods? So in other words, we're looking at the factors of production. And so here, we know that this is an input question because A, it just tells us it's the input question. But more specifically, it tells us the number of hours it takes to produce 1 loaf of bread and 1 bushel of corn. So this question isn't really looking at how many bushels of corn and how many loaves of bread this country can produce. It's looking at, well, how many hours does it take to produce that loaf of bread and to produce that 1 bushel of corn? And so here, with input questions, it's the other number goes under, so IOU. But we're still looking at the lower opportunity cost here. So here, right, for 1 loaf of bread, remember, its other number goes under because it's the input method. Well, here, for producing bread, what's the other good? The other good is going to be corn, right? So here, we take the 4, right? And we put the other number over 2, which equals 1/2 of corn. So that means for every loaf of bread that the U.S. produces, they're giving up half a bushel of corn. And then we could do the same thing, right? 1 corn, the U.S. is going to give up 2 loaves of bread. Well, what about for France, right? So if they're producing bread, what are they giving up? Well, they're giving up corn. And so if the other number goes over, it's 4/6, which is 2/3 corn. And then here we could say 1 corn. Well, if they're producing corn, what are they giving up? They're giving up bread. Since it's an input question, the other number goes under 6/4, which 3/2, right? So here, to figure out the comparative advantage, right, we just have to look at the lower opportunity cost here. Well, for the production of bread, if the U.S. produces 1 loaf of bread, they're giving up half a bushel of corn. For France, if they're producing 1 loaf of bread, they're giving up 2/3 of a bushel of corn here. So what is smaller, half a bushel or 2/3 of a bushel? Well, 0.5 is smaller than 0.66, repeating. So the U.S. should specialize and produce bread. They have the comparative advantage in the production of bread here. France, on the other hand, has the comparative advantage in the production of corn. Because here, for every bushel of corn, they're giving up 1.5 or 3/2 loaf of bread, while the U.S. is giving up 2 loaves of bread. Right? And so here's some more guided practice questions. We're going to go over these in depth in our next video for sake of time. All right, so if you guys just want to do it and then just watch the beginning of the next video just to check your answers, I would highly recommend that. And also, as usual, there's practice AP questions at the end of the day. There's going to be an additional video that goes over the answers and the steps needed to get to the right answer there. All right, guys, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.